2 days ago, someone named Ethan sent me trail camera footage that I probably shouldn't be showing you. The person who sent it begged me not to share their location, not to use their real name, and honestly, you can see why. This footage shows something standing 12 feet from a camera in a remote forest in Oregon. Something massive. Something covered in thick, dark fur. And here's the part that's kept me awake for the last 2 nights straight. It's not running away from the camera. It's not hiding. It's standing there, facing the camera directly, with one hand raised in the air like it's waving, like it knows exactly what a trail camera is and decided to say hello. This thing wanted to be photographed. It wanted us to know it exists. And that's what terrifies me most. Because if something this intelligent has been hiding in our forests for generations, and it's suddenly ready to be seen, we need to ask ourselves, what changed? What does it want? And what happens next? The person who sent this, Ethan, wants to remain anonymous, obviously. But they included a long email detailing nearly 3 years of encounters with this creature near their cabin deep in the mountains of southern Oregon. I'm going to share their story with you today exactly as they told it, and I'll throw in my own thoughts along the way. The coffee was still hot when Daniel noticed the dog was gone. That was the thing about mornings at the lake house. They had a rhythm so reliable, it felt almost mechanical. First light crept over the eastern ridge around 6:15, painting the water the color of old pewter. Then, the loons started calling from somewhere near the far shore, that hollow, trembling sound that carried across still water like a voice through an empty church. Then Daniel would pull on his flannel shirt, fill the French press, and step out onto the porch to watch the mist burn off the surface of the lake, while Scout padded around the yard, nose down, checking the perimeter the way she'd done every single morning for 6 years. He didn't notice right away that she wasn't there. He was looking at the water, the way it held the pale sky and its surface like something precious, thinking about nothing in particular, the way you can only think when you're genuinely alone and genuinely at peace. He had his coffee. He had the sound of the pines moving in the early breeze. He had 43 acres of northern Montana wilderness between himself and the nearest neighbor. He didn't need anything else. That was why he'd come here in the first place. 3 years ago, the life he'd been building in Chicago started coming apart at the seams in ways he didn't feel like explaining to anyone. The work, the apartment, the relationship that had seemed permanent right up until the moment it wasn't. All of it collapsed inside of about 8 months, with the quiet, grinding efficiency of a building that's lost its foundation. He didn't have a dramatic breakdown. He didn't make any speeches. He just found the listing for the lake property on a Thursday evening, drove out the following weekend, and wrote a check before he'd even seen the back acre. Something about standing at the edge of that cold, dark water, with nothing but forest on every side of him, told him this was the right decision, in a way that bypassed logic entirely. He'd been here 2 years now. He had his woodpile, his kayak, his vegetable garden, and Scout. He had enough freelance work to keep the lights on without ever needing to go into town more than once a week. And most importantly, he had silence. The specific, thick, layered silence of a conifer forest in early morning, which was nothing like the absence of sound. It was the presence of 1,000 small sounds that somehow added up to stillness. He looked down at his feet. Scout wasn't there. He called her name, not worried yet, just noticing. She sometimes wandered to the water's edge to watch the ducks, though she'd never been a dog who went far without checking back. He waited. Nothing. He called again, louder this time, and the sound of his own voice in that quiet felt strange. Too loud, too flat, absorbed immediately by the tree line. He set down his coffee and walked to the edge of the yard where the lawn gave way to a narrow strip of rocky shore. The lake was glassy and still. No Scout. He turned and scanned the yard, the side of the house, the trail that led into the woods toward the deer blind he'd built the previous fall. Nothing moving. Then he heard her. A single bark from somewhere in the trees to the north, high and sharp, and then nothing again. He felt the first faint thread of unease pull at the base of his chest, the kind you dismiss immediately because there's no reason for it yet. He walked toward the tree line. She was standing about 30 yards in, completely rigid, every muscle locked, staring at something deeper in the forest that Daniel couldn't see. Her hackles were raised along her spine in a clean, continuous ridge, and her tail was held perfectly horizontal, not tucked, not high, just still. She wasn't growling. That was the part that sent the unease from a thread to a cable, because Scout always growled. She was a vocal dog, opinionated about everything from squirrels to the sound of rain on the roof. But right now she was completely, utterly silent. Daniel followed her line of sight into the trees. Dense ponderosa pines, the understory dark and layered with shadow. The mist had gathered there in low drifts. Nothing he could see. Nothing moving. He called Scout by name, and she came, but reluctantly, stepping backward rather than turning, keeping her eyes on the trees until she was at his heel. He put his hand on her back and felt her trembling. He stood there another 30 seconds, listening. Then he went back inside and picked up his phone. There were 3 missed calls from Tom, and a text message that just said, "Watch this before you do anything else today. Call me immediately after." The video file was large. It took almost 2 minutes to download on the spotty rural connection. Daniel poured a second cup of coffee and waited, standing at the kitchen window, watching the yard and the tree line beyond it. Scout had positioned herself directly in front of the back door and was lying down facing it, which she had never done before in her life. The video loaded. It was trail camera footage. Timestamp in the lower right corner. Date from 3 weeks ago, 2:47 in the morning. Location not specified. The footage showed a narrow forest trail between tall, dark trees, caught in the black and white infrared wash of a night camera. For the first 4 seconds, nothing. Then something moved at the edge of the frame and stepped into full view. Daniel put down his coffee very carefully on the counter, without taking his eyes off the screen. It was standing upright. It was enormous, and it was looking directly into the camera with what appeared to be complete and unhurried awareness. One arm raised, hand open, in a gesture so unmistakably deliberate that the word waving arrived in Daniel's mind before he could stop it. He watched the clip 4 times. Then he called Tom. "Tell me where this was taken," Daniel said. "Montana," Tom said. "Specifically, about 40 miles northeast of where you're sitting right now." Daniel looked out the window at the tree line. The mist was still sitting in the trees to the north, pale and motionless, and he realized he'd been looking at it ever since he came inside without quite acknowledging why. Scout had not moved from in front of the back door. Tom sent the full file an hour later. 17 minutes of footage across 3 clips, all from the same camera, all within a 2-week window. Daniel watched them in order on his laptop at the kitchen table, with Scout lying against his feet. And by the end of the second clip, his rational framework for processing what he was seeing had started to develop visible cracks. The first clip was the one Tom had already sent. The standing figure, the raised hand, the direct engagement with the camera. Daniel had watched enough wildlife footage to know what animals looked like on trail cameras. The frozen, reflective-eyed paws of a deer, the slow, ambling investigation of a black bear, the low, quick movement of a coyote. They didn't look like this. This figure stood with the specific, balanced stillness of something that understood what a camera was and had made a considered decision about how to present itself. The second clip showed the same figure moving through the trees parallel to the camera at a distance of roughly 40 feet. The gait was what held Daniel's attention. He paused the footage and backed it up and watched the walking pattern 3 times in a row. Not the side-to-side shoulder roll of a bear. Not the forward lean of any quadruped moving bipedally. This was the heel-toe, counterbalancing stride of a habitual biped, fluid and efficient, covering ground with long steps that suggested enormous leg length. He pulled up a comparison video on his phone, a black bear walking upright, and watched them side by side. They did not look like the same category of thing. The third clip lasted 11 minutes and was the most disturbing of the 3, not because anything particularly dramatic happened in it, but because of what the figure was doing and how long it did it. It was crouched near what appeared to be a small stream, and it was placing rocks, deliberately, methodically, with evident precision, selecting individual stones from the stream bank, examining them, and positioning them in a pattern that Daniel couldn't fully make out from the camera angle. It worked for nearly 9 minutes without interruption, completely focused, occasionally holding a stone up to what passed for its face, as if checking some quality he couldn't identify. Then it stood, looked directly at the camera one more time, and walked away. Daniel closed the laptop. He sat at the table for a few minutes, doing nothing, which was unusual for him. He was not a person who sat and did nothing. He got up, found his jacket, and drove into town. The hardware store on Main Street carried trail cameras. He bought 4 of the best ones they had, along with extra batteries and 2 16-gigabyte SD cards. The woman behind the counter asked if he was having trouble with bears, and he said yes, which was easier than the truth, or anything close to it. He drove back and spent the afternoon installing the cameras. One on the North Trail at the edge of the property, aimed at the area where Scout had been standing that morning. One on the South Trail near the deer blind. One at the shore where the kayak was pulled up, mounted on the trunk of a large cedar, and one at the tree line nearest the house, aimed back toward the yard. He set all 4 to motion activation with the sensitivity turned high, checked the angles, replaced the batteries, and went back inside. That night he slept badly. Scout slept worse, lifting her head every hour or so at sounds Daniel couldn't hear. In the morning, 3 of the 4 cameras had triggered. The North Trail camera had captured 40 minutes of footage between 1 and 2 a.m., showing nothing. A deer at the edge of the frame. A raccoon. Wind in the branches. Normal. The South Trail camera had not triggered at all. The shore camera had triggered twice, once for what appeared to be an owl landing on a nearby branch, and once for nothing Daniel could identify. The frame was still, the water was still, and the trigger timestamp showed 3:22 a.m. The 4th camera, the one aimed at the yard from the tree line, was no longer where he had mounted it. He stood at the base of the cedar tree and stared at the empty bracket. The mounting hardware was intact. The screw hadn't stripped. The camera had been lifted cleanly off the bracket and set down, not thrown, not smashed, in the roots of the cedar, face up, still running, red indicator light blinking steadily. He picked it up and checked the footage. 90 seconds of tree canopy, the camera clearly carried from the bracket height down to the ground at a steady, controlled rate, not dropped. Then stillness. Then the edge of something enormous moving out of frame. He carried the camera to his porch and sat down and held it in both hands for a long time. That afternoon he drove back to the hardware store and bought a replacement. On the way home he stopped at the turnout on Route 12, where you could see the North Ridge, and he stood outside the truck and looked at the tree line for a while. Same dense ponderosa forest he'd looked at 1,000 times. Same layered shadow. Same silence. The same, and not the same at all. He got back in the truck and drove home, and found that someone, or something, had left 3 smooth, round stones in a perfect line on the top porch step, each one the same size, each one placed with its flattest surface down, stable, deliberate. He had been gone 90 minutes. He stepped over them carefully and went inside without touching them. He called Tom that night and told him about the camera. "It moved the camera," Tom said. "Set it down gently. Didn't break it. Didn't throw it." "Daniel, I know. That's not animal behavior." "I know that, Tom." There was a pause. Tom worked in digital media, had spent the better part of a decade chasing down viral footage and parsing hoaxes for a living. And Daniel could hear him working through it the same way he'd been working through it for the past 48 hours, trying to find the seam where the trick was hidden. The problem was that there wasn't one, or if there was, neither of them could find it. "The stones on the step," Tom said. "Still there. Don't move them." "I wasn't planning to." He didn't sleep that night. He sat at the kitchen table with the laptop open and went through everything he had, Tom's footage, his own 4 cameras, and built a rough timeline. The first sign on Tom's footage was 3 weeks ago. His camera had been moved last night. The stones on the step were this morning. Whatever was operating out there in the North Woods was becoming less careful about concealment, and it was doing it fast. At 4 in the morning, he took a flashlight and his rifle and walked the North Trail to where Scout had been standing the previous day. The beam of the flashlight swept across the forest floor and caught what he'd half expected and half dreaded. Footprints in a soft patch of ground between 2 exposed pine roots. He crouched down and looked at them. They were bipedal. They were enormous. And running through the nearest pine trunk at shoulder height was a long, smooth groove where the bark had been stripped away cleanly with something that had fingers. He went back to the house. He did not run. He walked steadily, and he kept the flashlight moving. And when he got inside, he locked the door and stood with his back against it for a moment before he was able to convince himself to move. He called Tom at 4:15 a.m. "I found tracks," he said. "I'm going in tomorrow, in daylight, with a camera." Tom didn't argue. "I'm driving up," he said instead. "You don't need to do that." "I know I don't need to. I'm doing it anyway. I'll be there by noon." Tom arrived at 11:40 carrying a drone, 2 action cameras, a satellite communicator, and a thermal imaging monocular that he claimed had cost more than Daniel's kayak. He set everything out on the kitchen table, and they looked at it together. "You're treating this like an expedition," Daniel said. "That's because it is one," Tom said, and picked up the thermal monocular and pointed it out the window at the tree line. He went still. "What?" Daniel said. Tom handed him the monocular without speaking. Daniel raised it to his eye and looked where Tom had been looking, at the northern tree line, 200 yards out. In the thermal spectrum, heat signatures showed as pale against the cool dark of the forest. There were 2 deer near the eastern edge, soft white shapes barely moving. There was the faint warmth of a squirrel on a branch, and there was something else, at the very edge of the tree line, directly north of the house. A large, pale shape, upright, standing still, watching the house. They didn't go north that afternoon. They went west, following the creek downstream, then cutting upslope to approach the north ridge from a direction that kept them away from whatever had been standing at the tree line. It was Tom's idea, and it was a good one. Whatever was out there knew the immediate perimeter of the property well enough to have approached within 200 yards of the house undetected, which meant approaching from the expected direction was exactly the wrong move. The forest was different once they were a mile in. Daniel had walked most of the accessible trails on his property and the surrounding national forest land, but this stretch felt less known, the undergrowth denser, the tree canopy closing out more of the sky. The mist from the morning hadn't fully lifted, and it sat in the low areas between ridges in flat white sheets that the light barely penetrated. They found the first marker 40 minutes in. It was easy to miss. A cluster of 3 sticks wedged vertically into the soft ground between 2 roots, forming a rough triangle about 8 inches on each side. Daniel almost stepped over it. Tom stopped and crouched down, and they looked at it together. "Animal?" Daniel said. Tom took a picture. "No animal does that." They found another one 20 yards further up the slope. Then another. The markers became more elaborate as they went deeper, sticks woven together in a lattice pattern, flat rocks balanced in careful stacks of 4 and 5, a section of bark peeled from a fallen log and propped at an angle against a living tree in a way that created a small shadowed space beneath it. The ground inside that space scraped smooth and clean. At the base of one marker, tucked under the edge of a flat rock, Tom found a small pile of objects. 3 pine cones, 2 smooth creek stones, both pale gray, both roughly the same size. A single deer antler tine, the clean white of old bone, placed with the pointed end facing upslope as if indicating a direction. They looked at each other. They followed the direction the antler pointed. The shelter was another quarter-mile upslope, set into the face of a granite outcropping in a way that used the rock as the back and one wall, with heavy branches woven together to form the remaining sides and a low roof. The construction was crude in the sense that no tool marks were visible, but sophisticated in the sense that it was clearly functional, angled to shed rain, positioned to break wind, oriented to capture morning sun while staying sheltered from the prevailing western exposure. Inside, the ground was depressed and shaped into a long oval, packed earth lined with a deep layer of dry grass and pine needles. The bedding was recent. Daniel could smell it. Tom was recording on the action camera. He panned slowly around the interior, then stopped. "Daniel," he said. Scratched into the stone of the back wall, at roughly chest height, were marks. Not random, not weathering. Lines and angles, some repeated, forming patterns that held internal consistency in a way that Daniel's brain kept trying to resolve into language or symbols without quite getting there. He photographed every inch of the wall. Then they backed out carefully, not disturbing anything, and stood outside in the mist. "This is one," Daniel said. "What?" "This is one shelter. One." He looked upslope, then along the ridge in both directions, then back down toward the valley. "Tom, how big is this forest?" Tom was quiet for a moment. Then he said, very carefully, "How many do you think there are?" The question hung in the cold air between them, and neither of them answered it, because answering it meant committing to the full weight of what they were standing in the middle of. The markers they'd followed weren't a trail to a single shelter. They were a network, a system. This wasn't one creature living in the wilderness on the margins of human territory. This was something organized, something with structure and memory and the specific, patient intelligence of a culture that had been accumulating here in these mountains for a very long time before anyone built a lake house on the southern shore and called it solitude. They made it back to the property line before dark. Neither of them spoke for most of the return walk. When they got inside and locked the door, Daniel checked his trail cameras. The one he'd reinstalled on the yard-facing cedar had been moved again, carried down and placed in the roots, face up, exactly as before. This time, there was footage on it. It showed a figure standing in the middle of the yard, directly in front of the house, for 4 minutes and 11 seconds, standing still, looking at the front door. The timestamp was from while they were in the forest. It had been watching the house while they were gone, and it had made sure they would know. Daniel left the offering on the porch rail the next morning before dawn. He'd spent most of the night sitting with Tom at the kitchen table, going through the wall photographs, trying to find patterns in the scratched symbols, and somewhere around 3 a.m., he'd made a decision that he couldn't entirely explain in rational terms, but that felt, in the particular exhausted clarity of that hour, like the only reasonable move available. If the thing was communicating, if the markers and the moved cameras and the stones on the step were a form of address, then not responding was itself a choice, and not necessarily a wise one. He put out a cloth bag containing dried fish, 2 apples, a folded piece of paper with a simple geometric shape drawn on it, a triangle, the same shape as the stick markers they'd found, and a smooth, flat creek stone he'd picked up from the shore that morning. He set it on the rail, went back inside, and did not check the shore camera again until after sunrise. At 5:17 a.m., the camera had triggered. The footage showed a shape moving to the porch in darkness, standing at the rail for a long moment, then taking the bag. The quality was poor, and the figure was partially obscured, but the movement was clear, and the size was unmistakable. It did not look around furtively. It did not flinch at the sounds of the house. It moved to the offering with the specific, unhurried confidence of something that was not afraid. When Daniel went out at 7, the cloth bag was gone. In its place, on the same section of porch rail, were 3 objects: a piece of quartz crystal, smoky gray, with a clean, natural fracture face that caught the morning light; a section of birch bark folded twice into a rough square; and a single large pine cone, with every scale removed, leaving just the bare central core, stripped clean, precise, and slightly unsettling in its neatness. He unfolded the birch bark. Inside was a pressed plant, dry and flat, some kind of small fern he didn't recognize. The pressing was deliberate, the frond arranged carefully before being folded into the bark, preserved. Not random, not accidental. Tom photographed everything. Neither of them said much. That evening, Daniel went to the shore alone. He told Tom he was checking the kayak, which was technically true. He walked to the water's edge as the light was going gold and orange across the western ridge, and he stood there for a while with his hands in his jacket pockets, looking at the far shore. The sound came from his left, from the trees along the northern shore, low and resonant, somewhere between a grunt and a sustained note, not aggressive in its quality, but enormous in its presence, the kind of sound you feel in your sternum before your ears fully process it. He turned toward it slowly. The figure was at the tree line, maybe 30 yards along the shore, standing upright, still. In the better light than he'd ever had before, in the long slant of the evening sun, he could see details. The layering of the fur, coarse and dark along the arms, lighter across the broad chest. The shape of the hands, hanging at the sides, enormous, clearly 5-fingered. The face, mostly in shadow under a heavy brow, but the eyes catching the light, dark and direct, and carrying in them a quality that Daniel could not process as animal. They looked at each other across 30 yards of pebbled shore. Then Daniel raised his right hand. The same gesture that had been on the trail camera footage Tom had sent him. Open hand, held still. He didn't think about it as a strategy. It was just the thing his body did. The figure was still for a long moment. Then it raised its hand. Open, held still. A direct echo of his gesture, performed with the same unhurried deliberateness that characterized everything he'd observed about this creature. Not mimicry. He was certain of that distinction in some wordless, instinctive way. Not a parrot repeating a sound. An acknowledgement. an answer. Then it turned, slowly, and pointed its open hand into the forest behind it. Not a vague gesture. A directed, intentional movement indicating a specific direction, deeper into the north woods, up the slope toward the ridge. It held the pointing gesture for a moment, watching him. From deeper in the trees, from multiple directions that Daniel could not quite triangulate, came sounds. The same low, resonant vocalization, but plural, overlapping, a chorus of presences announcing themselves in the darkening forest. Not threatening, not retreating, present. The figure lowered its arm, looked at him for another few seconds, then turned and walked into the trees and was gone, and the sounds from the forest slowly settled back into silence. Daniel stood on the shore for a long time in the cooling air. He was still standing there when Tom came down to find him 20 minutes later, and Tom took one look at his face and said nothing at all. Just stood beside him, looking at the dark tree line across the water, while the last of the light left the sky. He found the photograph in a library book 3 days later. Tom had driven into Missoula to pull whatever local historical records he could find. Land surveys, Forest Service documents, anything that covered the northern acreage systematically over time. Daniel had stayed at the lake and gone through the small collection of books he'd accumulated on regional history, picked up from used stores in town over 2 years. Most of them were unremarkable. Trail guides, a history of the timber industry, a general natural history of Montana's wildlife. The last book in the pile was a slim paperback history of the valley, published in 1987 by a local historical society. He'd bought it for $1 and never read past the first chapter. He read it now, cover to cover, at the kitchen table. The third chapter covered the valley's settlement period in the 1880s. Standard material: trappers, early homesteaders, the arrival of the railroad. But halfway through the chapter, there was a section about reports filed with the Territorial Land Office between 1882 and 1891, complaints and incident reports from settlers in the Northern Valley describing encounters with, as the text put it, with obvious editorial skepticism, large, unidentified figures in the forest. The reports described the same constellation of details that Daniel now recognized intimately: enormous footprints, disturbed camps, objects arranged deliberately near homesteads, nocturnal sounds, visual sightings at forest edges in low light. One report, from a homesteader named Caleb Marsh in 1886, described an incident in which the settler's young daughter had apparently spent an afternoon playing in the yard while her father worked in the fields, and had told her parents that evening that she had been visited by a large, hairy man who sat with her near the fence and watched her arrange stones. The girl, described as 4 years old and considered reliable by her father, said the visitor had rearranged her stone pile into a pattern she hadn't thought of herself, then walked back into the trees. The land office had noted the report and done nothing. Daniel was about to close the book when the photograph fell out from between pages that had been stuck together with age. It was a small sepia print, the kind of contact photograph common to the period, showing the exterior of a log homestead. A man and woman stood in front of the structure. Between them, half in shadow at the edge of the frame, stood a small girl. She was looking at something off to the left, out of the frame. Her arm was raised. Her hand was open. She was waving. He sat with the photograph for a long time. Tom called at 6 in the evening. He'd found Forest Service aerial survey records from 1934, 1957, 1972, and 1989. In each survey, the Northern Ridge area showed the same anomaly: a section of forest in a roughly triangular area about 3 miles across where the survey teams had noted unusual ground disturbance patterns, described variously across the decades as possible windfall damage, possible unauthorized campsite activity, and in the 1972 report, with no further elaboration, possible long-term habitation of unknown origin. Each survey recommended follow-up investigation. None of the records contained evidence that any follow-up had been conducted. "This goes back at least 140 years, Tom said. "Longer," Daniel said. "Much longer. We just only have the written record from the settlement period." "So they've been here the whole time." "The whole time." A silence on the line. "The gesture," Tom said. "The wave. Why now? Why are they making contact now, after all this time of staying hidden?" Daniel looked out the window at the northern tree line. It was dusk, the same hour when most of the encounters had happened, the light going flat and gray, and the shadows thickening at the forest edge. "I've been thinking about that," he said, "and I keep coming back to the same answer. Which is, we didn't change. They decided something changed. About us or about the situation. Something shifted in their assessment." That's a terrifying thought. Or a hopeful one, depending on what they decided. He said goodnight to Tom and set the phone down and stayed at the window. Scout had been restless all day, but she was calm now, lying under the table, and Daniel took some comfort from that. He made dinner and ate it standing at the counter, looking out at the darkening yard. He washed the dishes and dried them and put them away. He checked that the doors were locked, though he had become less certain over the past week about what locking the doors actually accomplished. He went to bed at 10 and was asleep by 11. At 2 a.m., he woke to Scout, making a sound he had never heard from her in 6 years. Not a bark, not a growl, not the low, warning rumble she used for strangers. A single, soft whine, the sound a dog makes when it encounters something it cannot place in any familiar category. He lay still in the dark and listened. The sound came from directly outside the bedroom window. The same slow, resonant vocalization he'd heard at the shore. Close, very close. And then a second voice answering it, from the other side of the house, and then a third, from somewhere beyond the front yard, further out toward the road. He lay in the dark and counted the voices, and understood that whatever had been happening in these mountains for 140 years of recorded history, whatever patient and intelligent presence had been moving through these forests and watching these houses and leaving stones on porch steps and pressing ferns in birch bark, had tonight decided that the distance between them and the solitary human in the lake house was not a distance that needed to be maintained anymore. The voices moved slowly around the perimeter of the house, not frantic, not aggressive, deliberate and unhurried, the way everything they did was deliberate and unhurried. Scout put her head on the bed beside his hand, and he felt her warm breath on his fingers in the dark. From directly outside the window, something breathed against the glass. And slowly, in the cold air of a Montana night, the pain began to fog. Now, before I tell you what Daniel found on his trail cameras the next morning, and there was footage that changes everything we've discussed in this video, I need to ask you something. If you've made it this far into this story, you already know this isn't the kind of content that gets made every week. Finding these accounts, verifying the details, building the timeline the way we've built it tonight, that takes time. And it takes people who care about getting it right. If that matters to you, hit subscribe right now and turn on notifications, because the next part of this story goes somewhere none of us were prepared for, and I don't want you to miss it when it drops. And I need to hear from you in the comments. Not just whether you believe this. I think that question has become almost beside the point by now. What I want to know is this. The survey records Tom found showed that anomaly on the northern ridge in 1934, 1957, 1972, and 1989. 4 separate decades. 4 separate teams of trained federal surveyors who looked at the same data and wrote the same recommendation, and then nothing happened. Tell me in the comments, do you think that was incompetence, bureaucratic indifference? Or do you think somebody, somewhere, looked at those follow-up reports and made a deliberate decision to leave that triangle of forest alone? Because I've been sitting with that question for 3 days now, and I cannot shake the feeling that the answer matters more than anything else in this story. Drop your theory below. I read every single one. The next morning, Daniel checked the cameras. The North Trail camera was exactly where he had mounted it. The South Trail camera was untouched. The shore camera had triggered 4 times between 2 and 4 a.m., but the SD card had been removed from the housing and was not on the ground beneath it, not in the roots of the cedar, not anywhere he could find in a 30-minute search of the surrounding area. The camera on the yard facing cedar was gone entirely, not moved, not set down carefully in the roots the way it had been before. Gone. The mounting bracket was still on the trunk, the screw was still in the wood. He stood in the yard in the early morning light and looked at the empty bracket and understood that whatever assessment had shifted in the night, whatever the circling voices and the fogged glass had meant, the terms of the arrangement had changed. He went back inside and called Tom. "They took the card," he said, "from the shore camera." Tom was quiet for a moment. "They know what a memory card is." "Yes." "Daniel, they didn't destroy it. They didn't smash the camera. They removed the card specifically." "I know." "That means they know what's on it." Daniel stood at the kitchen window. The yard was still and ordinary in the morning light. Scout was at his feet, calm, tail moving slowly. On the porch rail, where he had left nothing the night before, sat a single object. A flat piece of shale, roughly rectangular, about the size of a paperback book. Something had been scratched into its surface, not random lines, the same kind of marks he and Tom had photographed on the shelter wall, angular, deliberate, internally consistent. The same marks, but arranged differently, a new configuration he hadn't seen before. He photographed it and sent it to Tom without comment. Tom called back in 4 minutes. "That's not the same pattern as the wall," he said. "No." "It's a response," Tom said, "to something. Daniel, it's a response to something specific." Daniel picked up the piece of shale and turned it over in his hands. On the back, scratched with the same careful precision, was a shape he recognized immediately. A triangle, 8 inches on each side. The same shape he had drawn on the piece of paper he'd left in the offering bag 4 days ago. They had written back.